Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Timeless Stories, the place where history comes alive through the most extraordinary lives ever lived today. I want to take you on an unforgettable journey to ancient Egypt more than 2,000 years ago to tell you the story of one of the most remarkable women who ever walked. Was Cleopatra Earth. And she was the last queen of a civilization that had lasted for thousands of years. This is a story of power, love, betrayal, and courage, and I promise you, every single chapter will leave you wanting more so. Make yourself comfortable, take a deep breath, and let us travel back in time together. Matt. In the year 69 BCE, in the magnificent city of Alexandria, Egypt, a baby girl was born into one of the most powerful royal families in the ancient world. No one could have known then that this child would one day become the most famous queen. In history, her name was Cleopatra VII, and from the very first day of her life, she was destined for something extraordinary. Alexandria was not just any city. It was one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, with towering libraries, grand palaces, and busy harbors filled with ships from every corner of the earth. Cleopatra was born here into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a royal family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. But here is something fascinating about this family. Even though they ruled Egypt, they were originally Greek. Her ancestor, Ptolemy I, had been a general under the legendary Alexander the Great. And when Alexander died, Ptolemy took control of Egypt and made it his kingdom. Growing up in the royal palace, Cleopatra had everything a child could want: beautiful clothes, the finest food servants to attend to her every need, and tutors who taught her the greatest knowledge of the age. But Cleopatra was not just a girl who enjoyed luxury. She was hungry for knowledge in a way that was rare, even among royals. While her siblings played, Cleopatra studied. She buried herself in books and scrolls, learning about science, mathematics, philosophy, and the art of leadership. But perhaps what made Cleopatra most extraordinary was her gift for languages. In an age when most rulers communicated through translators, Cleopatra taught herself to speak many languages fluently, including Greek, Latin, Egyptian, Persian, and several others. It is said she was the first ruler of her dynasty in nearly 300 years to actually learn and speak the Egyptian language. This was not just impressive. It was a powerful political statement. It told the Egyptian people that their queen truly belonged to them. Cleopatra also studied the religion and culture of Egypt deeply. She learned the stories of the ancient gods. She respected Egyptian traditions. And she understood that to truly rule this land, she needed to be more than a Greek princess wearing a crown. She needed to become Egyptian in her heart and soul. But life in the royal palace was never completely safe. Cleopatra's father, King Ptolemy the 12th, was a ruler who struggled to hold on to power. Rome, the great empire rising in the west, was growing stronger every year, and Egypt, like many smaller kingdoms, lived in the shadow of Roman power. Cleopatra watched her father navigate these dangerous political waters, sometimes bowing to Rome, sometimes fighting against powerful advisors within his own court. She learned early that being royal meant living with danger every single day. And then, when Cleopatra was still a teenager, the world around her began to shift. Her father's health was failing, and the question of who would rule Egypt next was becoming a matter of life and death. Young Cleopatra was already preparing herself for that day, studying learning planning and waiting for her moment to come. And that moment was closer than anyone realized. When Cleopatra was around 18 years old, her father, King Ptolemy XII, died, and Egypt needed a new ruler. In his will, the king had declared that Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, would rule Egypt together as co-rulers. Her brother was only 10 years old, just a little boy, while Cleopatra was already a brilliant and experienced young woman who had been preparing her whole life for this moment. At first, Cleopatra tried to lead as a strong and decisive queen. She made decisions, she issued commands, and she began to govern Egypt with intelligence and vision. But trouble came quickly. Her brother's powerful advisors did not want a strong woman on the throne. They wanted to control the young king and use him as a puppet. They began plotting against Cleopatra, spreading rumors, undermining her authority, and slowly pushing her out of power. Within just a few years, Cleopatra found herself in an almost unimaginable situation. She was the rightful queen of Egypt, but she had been forced out of her own palace. Imagine that the queen of one of the richest kingdoms in the ancient world wandering through the desert with only a small group of loyal followers. No palace, no throne, no army, just her wits, her determination, and her unbreakable will. But Cleopatra was never the kind of woman who accepted defeat. She immediately began making plans to take back what was rightfully hers. She traveled to the border regions of Egypt, gathering support from local tribes and soldiers who were loyal to her, building a small force that could challenge her brother's advisors. Then, fate brought an extraordinary opportunity to her doorstep. A Roman general named Julius Caesar had arrived in Egypt, following his rival Pompey. Caesar was one of the most powerful men in the entire Roman world, a brilliant military commander, a cunning politician, and a man who held enormous influence over the fate of kingdoms and empires. Cleopatra saw immediately that Caesar was the key to her return to power. But here was the problem. Caesar was staying in her palace, where her enemies controlled access. Cleopatra could not simply walk through the front door without being captured or killed. So she did something that shows just how bold and creative she truly was. She had herself smuggled into the palace, rolled up inside a large bundle of cloth, or, according to some accounts, a carpet, and carried directly to Caesar's private quarters. When Caesar unrolled that bundle and found himself face to face with the Queen of Egypt, he must have been astonished. But what impressed him even more than her dramatic entrance was Cleopatra herself. She spoke to him directly, boldly, and brilliantly. She made her case with intelligence and passion, and she showed Caesar that she was not just a queen, she was a force of nature. Caesar was captivated. He agreed to support Cleopatra, and together they faced her brother's forces in battle. Young Ptolemy the 13th was defeated, and Cleopatra was restored to her throne. But she was not the same young woman who had been pushed out of the palace. She was now stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever, and she had a powerful Roman general standing beside her. Cleopatra was back on her throne, but the story was only just beginning, because now she and Julius Caesar were not just political allies. They had fallen deeply in love. Their connection was one of the great romances of the ancient world, and it would change the course of history. Think about who these two people were. Cleopatra was 21 years old, brilliant, fearless, and burning with ambition. Caesar was around 52, battle-hardened, experienced, and the most powerful military and political figure in the Roman world. They were different in age, different in background, different in everything except the fire that burned inside them both. And that shared fire drew them together like two stars pulled into each other's orbit. Cleopatra invited Caesar to remain in Egypt for a time, and he accepted. Together they traveled along the great Nile River on magnificent royal barges. Cleopatra showed Caesar the wonders of her kingdom, the ancient temples, the towering monuments, the fertile fields along the river banks, and the wealthy, bustling city of Alexandria. Caesar saw that Egypt was not just a beautiful land, it was an incredibly rich and powerful kingdom. And Cleopatra was exactly the kind of ruler it deserved. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, but the world knew him by his nickname Caesarion, which meant Little Caesar. Cleopatra was overjoyed, not just because she was a mother, but because she saw in this child a symbol of something extraordinary, the possibility of one day uniting the power of Egypt and Rome in a single dynasty. But the joy of new motherhood was shadowed by political reality. Caesar could not remain in Egypt forever. Rome needed him, and his absence was causing problems back home. He invited Cleopatra to come to Rome with him, and she accepted, sailing into the greatest city in the world with her son, her servants, and all the golden splendor of the Egyptian court. Rome had never seen anything quite like Cleopatra. She was exotic, She was glamorous, she was brilliant, and she was completely unafraid. To be different in a city full of proud Roman men and women who believed. Rome was the center of the universe. Cleopatra walked with the confidence of a woman who knew her own worth. The Romans were fascinated by her, but many were also deeply suspicious of a foreign queen living in their city. As the companion of their most powerful leader made many people very uncomfortable. And then in 44 BCE, the world changed forever. Julius Caesar was assassinated, stabbed to death in the Roman Senate by a group of men who feared he was becoming too powerful. Cleopatra lost not only her greatest ally, but also the father of her son. The shock and grief must have been overwhelming. But Cleopatra had no time to be paralyzed by sorrow. She knew that without Caesar's protection, she was vulnerable. She quickly gathered her son and her household and sailed back to Egypt. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra faced the hardest task of her life, ruling alone, in a world where powerful men were fighting over the pieces of Caesar's empire. She had to keep Egypt safe. She had to protect her son. And she had to find a way to navigate a world that had just become much more dangerous. After Caesar's death, the Roman world was divided among three powerful men, Marcus Antonius, known to history as Mark Antony Octavian, who was Caesar's adopted son, and a general named Lepidus. Together, they formed what historians call the Second Triumvirate. But it was clear from the start that Antony and Octavian were the two men who truly mattered, and that they would one day clash for total control of Rome. Mark Antony was everything you might imagine a Roman hero to be: tall, powerful, brave in battle, and magnetic in personality. He commanded loyalty from his soldiers and admiration from almost everyone who knew him. After the triumvirate divided the Roman world, Antony took the eastern regions as his territory, which meant he was now the most powerful Roman figure closest to Egypt. Antony wanted to meet Cleopatra. He needed Egypt's enormous wealth to fund his military campaigns, and Cleopatra needed a powerful Roman partner to protect Egypt. So Antony sent a message asking the queen to meet him in the city of Tarsus, in what is now the country of Turkey. Cleopatra could have arrived quietly and diplomatically, but quiet was never her style. She decided to make an entrance that no one would ever forget. She sailed to Tarsus on a magnificent golden ship with silver oars and purple sails. She dressed herself as Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, and surrounded herself with servants dressed as sea nymphs and cupids. The ship moved through the water, trailing clouds of sweet perfume, and the people who lined the harbor to watch her arrive were so astonished they could barely speak. Mark Antony was waiting for Cleopatra at his official seat of authority. But according to ancient accounts, the crowds abandoned him entirely to go and see the arrival of the Egyptian queen. he reportedly sat alone at his table, while every single person in the city rushed to the harbor to witness the spectacle. Imagine that the most powerful Roman general in the East sitting completely alone because everyone preferred to watch Cleopatra arrive. When they finally met in person, the chemistry between them was immediate and electric. Antony was charmed, delighted, and completely captivated. Cleopatra was everything he had heard, and so much more brilliant, witty, funny, bold, and utterly confident in herself. Their conversations lasted for hours. They laughed, they debated, they planned, and they fell in love. Antony came to Alexandria, and what began as a political alliance quickly became one of the most celebrated love affairs in all of history. Together, they created a kind of royal club called the Inimitable Livers, a group of friends who feasted, hunted, sailed, and celebrated life together. They went on fishing trips. They disguised themselves as ordinary people and wandered through the streets of Alexandria together. They played pranks and hosted legendary banquets, and in all the long years of their partnership, their bond only grew stronger. Cleopatra gave birth to 3 of Antony's children, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later a son named Ptolemy Philadelphus. Antony gave to Cleopatra and her children territories and titles that caused outrage in Rome, where Octavian was watching everything very carefully and growing increasingly angry. Because while Antony and Cleopatra were living their magnificent life together, Octavian was building his power in the West and using their relationship as a weapon against Antony. He told the Roman people that Antony had been bewitched by a foreign queen, that he had abandoned Roman values, and that Cleopatra intended to make herself ruler of Rome itself. The propaganda was vicious and effective, and slowly the opinion in Rome turned against Antony. The conflict between Octavian and Antony could not be avoided forever. By 31 BCE, the two sides were preparing for war. Octavian had officially declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra, portraying her as a foreign enemy of Rome. It was a clever political move because it avoided the appearance of a Roman civil war while still achieving the same result. Cleopatra and Antony gathered their forces and prepared to fight. They had a combined fleet of warships and a strong land army, and they chose to meet Octavian's forces at sea near the western coast of Greece in a place called Actium. The Battle of Actium would decide the fate of the ancient world. The battle was a disaster for Cleopatra and Antony. Exactly what went wrong is something historians have debated for 2,000 years. Some say Cleopatra's ships retreated because of damage or disease among her sailors. Others say it was a strategic decision that was tragically misunderstood. Whatever the reason, when Cleopatra's fleet turned and sailed away from the battle, Antony's forces lost their coherence and fell into confusion. Octavian's navy seized the advantage, and the battle was lost. Antony followed Cleopatra back to Egypt, and for a time it seemed like they might find a way to survive. They considered fleeing to the east or to Spain, or even to India, but Octavian pursued them relentlessly. He did not intend to let them escape. He wanted total victory. In August of 30 BCE, Octavian's forces entered Egypt, and the end came quickly. Antony received a false report that Cleopatra was dead, broken by this news and defeated in battle. He fell on his own sword, as was the custom for a Roman soldier who faced dishonor. He did not die immediately, and his servants managed to bring him to Cleopatra, who was hiding in a fortified building near her palace. Imagine that final scene, the great Roman warrior dying in the arms of the queen he loved, while the world they had built together crumbled around them. Cleopatra was now alone, and she knew exactly what Octavian intended for her. He planned to take her to Rome as his greatest trophy, to parade her through the streets in chains as proof of his victory. The Romans loved these triumph ceremonies where conquered kings and queens were displayed to the crowd as symbols of Roman power. Cleopatra had seen it happen to others, and she was absolutely determined it would not happen to her. She was a queen, and she would die as one. In her final days, Cleopatra met with Octavian, and observers noted that even in defeat, she carried herself with complete dignity. She dressed immaculately. She spoke with intelligence and composure, and she showed no sign of breaking. But she was also making her final preparations. On the 12th of August in the year 30 BCE, Cleopatra was found dead in her royal chamber. She lay dressed in her full royal regalia, crown jewels, and robes of state, exactly as she had appeared on the most magnificent occasions of her reign. The ancient accounts say that she died from the bite of a venomous snake, an asp that had been smuggled to her in a basket of figs. Whether this is literally true, or whether it is a poetic story that later generations told about her death, the meaning is the same. Cleopatra chose the terms of her own ending. She would not be conquered. She would not be humiliated. She would go out as she had lived on her own terms, with her head held high. When Octavian received the news, he was reportedly frustrated that she had escaped his plans, but even he could not deny the power of what she had done. The ancient world was stunned. Egypt became a Roman province. The Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled for nearly 300 years came to an end, and an era of history closed forever. But Cleopatra herself was never forgotten. Not for a single generation since her death has the world stopped telling her story. Writers painted her. Poets wrote about her. Playwrights put her on stage. Historians argued about her, and she has inspired more creative works than almost any other figure from the ancient world. because her story has everything: ambition, love, betrayal, courage, and an ending so dramatic it could only have belonged to her. The legacy of Cleopatra is not simply that she was beautiful or that she had famous lovers. Her legacy is that she was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and capability, who ruled one of the great kingdoms of the ancient world on her own terms, who fought for her country until there was nothing left to fight for, and who faced even death with the composure and dignity of someone who knew exactly who she was. And so, my friends, as we come to the end of this incredible journey through history, I want you to think about what Cleopatra's story means, not just as history, but as a lesson for our own lives. She reminds us that intelligence and knowledge are the most powerful weapons anyone can have. She reminds us that true courage is not about never being afraid, but about acting with purpose and dignity, even when you are afraid. And she reminds us that how we face our greatest challenges says more about who we are than any crown or title ever could. Cleopatra lived 2,000 years ago, but the qualities that made her extraordinary are just as relevant and admirable today as they were then. So be bold, be curious, learn everything you can, and never let anyone tell you that you are less than what you know yourself to be. Thank you so much for spending this time with Timeless Stories today. The Mord. If Cleopatra's story moved you or inspired you, or simply made history feel alive for you, then this channel has done exactly what it was made to do. There are so many more incredible stories waiting for you here. Stories of warriors and explorers, of artists and revolutionaries, of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. So stay with us, because history is never boring when it is told the right way. And we will see you in the next chapter.